is because carbon dioxide is the major and most important gas in the atmosphere that we call a greenhouse gas. And a greenhouse gas, just as the name implies, magnifies the heat just like the glass panes in a greenhouse that we might grow tomatoes in. And this is a really good thing because if we didn't have greenhouse gases, the Earth would be frozen solid and life as we know it, certainly as we know it, wouldn't exist. If there'd be any life at all, this would be a frozen mass of inert planet. But because of the greenhouse effect, the sun's radiation passes through the Earth's atmosphere, hits the surface of the Earth, and some of that is re-radiated back into space, but some of it is captured and absorbed and re-radiated in the Earth's atmosphere through these greenhouse gases. So on the right here, we see when there's more greenhouse gases, more of that heat energy is trapped and re-radiated, and hence the atmosphere warms. So it's a good thing to a point, but too much of a good thing can cause problems. And this, in essence, is climate change, is the increase of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, primarily carbon dioxide. Methane is probably the next most important one, and then there are several others that are warming the Earth and driving climate change. Okay, so how did we get to this situation where we're having increased greenhouse gases in the atmosphere driving climate change? For this part of the story, I have to go back to the Carboniferous period about 300 million years ago. So this is an artist's reconception of what much of the Earth looked like. At this time, much of the Earth was covered in swamps. Lots and lots of living things on the Earth at this time, but lots and lots of swamps. And so when these living things in the Carboniferous period died, much of them fell into these swamps. And it turns out these swamps did not have much, if any, oxygen in them. They were anaerobic. So remember, I was saying that carbon is released in the form of carbon dioxide by decomposition in the presence of oxygen. In this period of the Earth's history, there was little to no oxygen. So much of the carbon in these living things got stuck in these swamps, and the cycle was interrupted. So what happened in the Carboniferous period was large, vast quantities of carbon were taken out of the atmosphere in the form of photosynthesis, locked in these swamps because decomposition stopped because there was no oxygen. Over long periods of time, and I'm talking tens of millions of years, depending on the specifics of the environment and geologic pressures, heat, those stuck non-decomposing remains of once living things turned into coal, oil, and natural gas. If you've ever wondered, why do we call those things fossil fuels? Many people don't actually realize that it's literally fossils. When we're burning coal, oil, and natural gas, that's the fossilized remains of things from the Carboniferous period that got stuck in the decomposition process and turned into these carbon-dense materials that we call fossil fuels, coal, oil, and natural gas. Okay, so by the end of the Carboniferous period, it was the exact opposite of what's happening today. There was a lot less carbon dioxide in the atmosphere because it had been pulled out of the atmosphere through photosynthesis and locked up in these swamps that today we call coal, oil, and natural gas. So the Earth got a lot colder by the end of the Carboniferous period because there was a lot less greenhouse gases and the greenhouse effect was a lot more diminished. Okay, so let's go back to the carbon cycle. If you were really paying attention, you may have noticed something I didn't talk about when I first showed this slide, and that is these smokestacks in the back here with this arrow saying combustion. So the reason that's in this slide is a couple hundred years ago, human beings figured out that these things in the ground, this coal, oil, and natural gas, and it began with coal, have incredible energy density. We started figuring out that we could get this stuff and we could burn it. We could use it for all kinds of things that were far more powerful than things like wood and animal dung that we had been burning before that. And this powered in the Western Hemisphere the Industrial Revolution, as we know. And it led to incredible wealth of energy that we really take for granted today. Is that extracting and figuring out how to process and burn these fossil fuels just dramatically changed the human trajectory, and we could do all kinds of things. What we didn't foresee at first, although what I find fascinating, is by the time the Industrial Revolution hit in England, there were scientists who were already concerned and understanding that this was going to drive what today we would call climate change. So it's not like we didn't figure it out, but few people understood it until relatively recently. We did the exact opposite of what happened in the Carboniferous period. We took huge quantities of carbon that were locked in the earth, we pulled them out of the earth and we burned them, and we dumped huge quantities of carbon into the atmosphere. At the same time, while we were doing that, we were increasingly clearing the Earth's forests, which had the effect of diminishing the Earth's ability to pull the carbon out of the atmosphere through photosynthesis. So it's kind of a double whammy. Dumping carbon into the atmosphere and diminishing the planet's ability to take it out through photosynthesis. Hence, rising concentrations of greenhouse gases, hence warming Earth and what today we call climate change. Okay, so if you understand the carbon cycle, it's not that hard to understand what's happening here, where this carbon is coming from, and how it's driving the rising temperatures on the Earth. How high are carbon dioxide concentrations? Well, they're really high. You have to go all the way back to the Pliocene, which was 3 to 5 million years ago, to go back to a time in Earth's history that carbon dioxide concentrations were as high as they are today. It was a very different planet back then. It was much warmer and much wetter. Sea levels were about 100 feet higher than they are today. And if you map 100 feet rise in sea level on today's planet, you're talking about billions of people who are underwater. Very different times, very different planet. If you remember human discovery of agriculture and the sort of the birth of large civilizations, it's only about 10,000 years old. So we have evolved as a sort of abundant, civilized species in this real sweet spot. For about the last 10,000 years, carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere have been in this sweet spot of not too hot, not too cold, that have allowed us humans to do the incredible things we have done. We cannot have civilization as we know it on a planet with this level of carbon dioxide for very long. And this is driven primarily by the extraction and burning of fossil fuels. And this graph stops at 2015, when carbon dioxide concentrations were 400, but we could extend the graph to 2024. I actually just checked this morning, and current concentrations of carbon dioxide are 423 today. So this graph continues pretty much in a straight line. The scientific consensus of what the safe upper limit of carbon dioxide concentrations is that we can still have a habitable planet with life and civilization as we know it was actually exceeded all the way back around 1990, because that safe upper limit was 350. So Houston, we have a problem here. We've shot past the safe upper limit, and we are continuing to increase in carbon dioxide concentrations. Why do we care about this? There are many reasons. This particular graph is just showing some of the social and economic implications of climate change. And so you may be familiar with some of them, maybe some of them aren't as familiar to you. Probably the one that most people are most familiar with is over here, the cost of adapting coastal areas to rising sea levels. So this increased heat is much stronger and faster at the poles. So we're melting ice at record rates, and that land-based ice, when it melts, goes into the sea, which rises sea level. Most of the increased heat from climate change has actually been absorbed in the oceans. And so the oceans are much warmer, and warmer water takes up more space than colder water. So sea level rise is due to both rising sea levels due to ice melting and the fact that the ocean itself is much warmer than it used to be. So rising sea levels are causing relocation of whole communities. People in low-lying islands have already had to evacuate. In many coastal areas, the fresh water is being infiltrated by rising saltwater intrusion. So that's just one of many different social and economic impacts that's being driven by the rise in carbon dioxide and the warming of the Earth. Here's what some of this looks like just in pictures. The rising temperature, the changing moisture pattern is leading to dramatic changes in fire cycles. We don't have to look much further than the Western United States, where many parts are now in perpetual fire season. Many parts of California are susceptible to burning all year round rather than a short fire season like they used to have. We're turning areas that used to be rich agricultural breadbasket areas, they're too hot and too dry, and we're turning those into deserts. And again, that increased heat in the ocean, all of that energy is driving increasing frequency and intensity of storms. All that heat is creating unprecedentedly powerful, fast-moving hurricanes, which, again, if I suspect most of you following the news have a sense of how devastating those hurricanes have been. So these are just three of the consequences of the rising greenhouse gases warming the Earth and kind of wreaking havoc on the Earth's systems. The scientific community, the thing that I think is most sobering and alarming to us is what we call positive feedback loops, where this warming can start to drive cycles that feed on themselves, that are kind of like a snowball rolling off a cliff, getting faster and bigger, like a runaway train. Again, probably the one most people are most familiar with is the vanishing Arctic ice. And so the way this positive feedback loop works is the temperatures are rising much faster at the poles, as I mentioned. And what that's doing is that's creating large sections that were white sheets of ice, that white reflecting most of the heat back into space. As that ice melts, it's turning into dark colored seawater. That dark seawater absorbs and then re-radiates much more heat than the sheets of white ice. So that's driving faster rising temperatures at the poles, which in turn is melting more ice, and the cycle feeds on itself. And that kind of positive feedback loop, this schematic is just showing 6 of them. There are plenty more. And scientists are deeply concerned that we may reach what we call tipping points, whereby no matter what we do, we cannot stop, let alone reverse these cycles, that the snowball has too much momentum and it's beyond our knowledge and our technology to do something. And if we cross these tipping points and these cycles continue, that's pretty frightening what the consequences are. So some of the effects of climate change are really obvious, and some of them are a little bit more subtle. And this is one of them that the scientific community tends to be far more aware and concerned about these than the public, who doesn't quite grasp the magnitude of the threat of these feedback loops. All right, so what do we do about this? I'm going to come back to the carbon cycle because on one level, it's super obvious, right? It's not rocket science. If you understand the carbon cycle and the greenhouse effect, what do? We stop pumping carbon into the atmosphere. We stop extracting and burning these fossil fuels. We leave that carbon in the ground. At the same time, not only do we stop diminishing the ability of the Earth to take that carbon out through photosynthesis by the massive deforestation we do, we preserve and restore our remaining forest, and we plant a lot more trees to enhance the planet's ability to take the carbon out of the atmosphere. So it's really conceptually super simple. Stop pumping carbon into the atmosphere, enhance the Earth's ability to take carbon out of the atmosphere, reduce greenhouse gas concentrations, reverse the warming effect, right? It's really not that complicated on a conceptual level. That's why the carbon cycle is key to understanding what's causing climate change and how to combat it. Here's where the good news and the exciting part comes in. We have pretty much solved the technological components of how to do what I was just saying. We know how to do it. We're really good at solving technological problems. We don't have to get our energy from fossil fuels anymore. We can get it from clean, renewable, abundant sources like the sun through solar power, like the wind, like moving water. And this graph is just showing just how good we've got at this. The price per watt of solar energy has fallen more than 400 times from the 70s till now. And if I extended this graph, it would be even more impressive. It's cheaper than fossil fuels in most of the world to get our energy from the sun or from the wind. Sometimes people will say, yeah, but the sun doesn't always shine and the wind doesn't always blow. Our technology can handle that now. I could show you the same cost curve for batteries that can store the energy so that when the sun isn't shining or the wind isn't blowing, we can store that energy and use it when we need to. We've gotten much better at using energy efficiently. On it goes, right? The technological part of this, we've really solved this. Think how much better computers and cell phones are now than they used to be. It's the exact same thing with renewable clean energy. So it is just not true that we need to keep extracting and burning fossil fuels to have the kinds of lifestyles that we've been privileged to become accustomed to from the incredible energy in fossil fuels. So that's super exciting and inspiring for me. The last slide that I'll show is what I used to end with my students. Many of the students that I would have in my climate classes came from very conservative backgrounds. They grew up with a heavy dose of Fox News and other sources, and they'd come into my class either knowing nothing at all about climate change, or what they knew led them to believe that it was some big conspiracy or some big hoax. So this is my favorite cartoon with climate change because I love the simplicity of it. Like, okay, let's say it is a big hoax and this is all faked and the ice isn't really melting and the greenhouse gases aren't really accumulating and on and on. Wouldn't we want to do all of the things we have to do to combat climate change anyway? Even if climate change didn't exist, fossil fuels are pretty horrible things in modern society. Extracting, processing, and burning them is a really dirty business. Tens of millions of people every year are sickened and die from breathing the air that's contaminated from burning fossil fuels. There's a huge environmental injustice issue here. The people who have the least political power, who have the least affluence and education, disproportionately suffer from the fossil fuel industry. The people in the Southern Appalachians whose mountains are being blown up in mountaintop coal removal to get the coal, they are suffering disproportionately as their whole communities are destroyed. Their whole culture and way of life is destroyed. The people who live near the oil refineries, the people whose backyards are being fracked for natural gas, many of them are non-white people who are suffering horribly. It's a horrible thing. Even if climate change didn't exist, this is something that we would want to stop. We're poisoning ourselves and we're leaving our grandchildren a horribly diminished world. So we have compelling reasons to stop using fossil fuels. Energy independence. Wouldn't you rather get your energy from the sun and the wind than have to keep paying these unbelievably powerful fossil fuel corporations that are using that power to serve their own interests and not our interest and not the planet's interest? The concentration of wealth and power in the fossil fuel industry is unprecedented in the history of our species. Wouldn't we want to preserve our rainforests anyway? I've been talking about human species, but think about all the species we share the planet with whose habitat is destroyed. Those of you who listen to the podcast, the Christiana Figueres podcast, you may remember her whole inspiration for becoming a climate activist was her love of the Costa Rican rainforest and particularly the golden toad that she particularly loved as a young girl, wanted to show her children and found that that species had gone extinct. So compelling reasons to save and restore and preserve and expand our forests. And on it goes. Don't we want to have higher quality, safe, sustainable jobs? Wouldn't you rather be installing solar panels than blowing up mountains and breathing coal dust? Right? So clean water, healthy children, livable cities, right? So my last point is, even if it wasn't for climate change, we'd still want to do all these things because this is central to making a better world. And so what I am spending my time and energy on, along with so many other people, is trying to figure out how to make this transition happen in a just and equitable way, because there are so many good things that will happen as we're addressing climate change. We can make such a better, more just, equitable world. And how to do that is what I hope we'll focus much of our discussion on today. So I'm gonna stop with the slides, and before we throw it open to the larger discussion,